Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this important webinar this afternoon. My name is Lynn Rubenstein. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Recycling Council. This webinar is being jointly hosted by NERC and NEWMOA, the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. And in a moment, you'll hear from their Executive Director, Terry Goldberg. I'd like to thank not only you for being here, but our two excellent speakers that Terry will be introducing. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive notification of the of the webinar being posted both on the NERC and NEWMOA websites. In addition, while you are all muted, we definitely want to hear your questions. So on the right-hand side of your computer, either in a fully drop-down bar, the dashboard for GoToWebinar, you'll see the questions box. So you type in a question there, and we'll be monitoring the questions throughout the webinar. We're going to save the questions until both presentations have been completed. If you're not familiar with the GoToWebinar and your dashboard has vanished, you will notice at the top right of your screen a little orange arrow, and it's likely pointing to the left. To find the question box, click on that arrow and point it to the right, and then you will see the question box. So we are very, very grateful to our panelists and for this opportunity to present this important information to you. And with that, Terry, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Again, I want to echo Lynn's appreciation for all of the folks who are joining us today and for our two excellent presenters. I'm really excited about this webinar topic, and I think it's extremely timely and important right now. So our first presenter is Katy Fraklin. She serves as the Operations Director at Reef. Reef is a nonprofit that advances data-driven solutions to reduce the amount of food that goes to waste in the U.S. As a seasoned development practitioner in the food waste sector, Katy oversees all organizational development and strategy. Working closely with the executive team, she also leads fundraising efforts, acting as the liaison with donor clients and identifying new donor bases to enhance Reef's profile. She is committed to fostering an efficient and equitable food system where people truly value and appreciate the resources, labor, and love that have gone into the food they eat. And as you can see, hopefully her slides are just displayed already. She's going to be talking about food waste in the midst of the COVID-19 situation. Following Katy will be our second presenter. Her name is Ariel Maria Ardura. She works as a clinical fellow at the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic. The abbreviation is FLPC. Arielle received her JD in 2019 from Georgetown University Law Center, where she gained a range of experience in food and health law and policy through internships with FLPC, the District of Columbia Food Policy Director, USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, and as the Emily Spitzer intern for the National Health Law Program. She also worked as a student attorney on the health and food team of Georgetown's Public Policy Clinic and as a research assistant for Georgetown's Health Justice Alliance. Prior to law school, Arielle worked for an organization that helps schools implement food recovery programs. She received a Bachelor of Urban and Environmental Planning from the University of Virginia. She's going to be talking about food waste policy using systems change to stop squandering one of our greatest resources. So take it away, Katy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lynn and Terry. And thank you everyone for joining this important discussion on food waste and COVID-19. And just a huge thank you to NERC and NEWMOA for convening us today and providing a platform for this discussion. So my name is Katy Fraklin, and as Terry mentioned, I'm the Operations Director at Reef, where I oversee operations and development. I've been working at Reef the past 3 years and have been working on food waste for about 7 now. And between my time at Reef and with other organizations, I've had the good fortune of working on a broad spectrum of food waste interventions, from academic and market research to consumer education, working with businesses and events of all sizes, impact investing, and more. And throughout my work, I've learned the true value and power of communication, coordination, and collaboration to drive change at scale. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation with all of you today. For those of you who aren't familiar with ReefEd, we are a national nonprofit with a holistic view of the food system, working to advance solutions to reduce the amount of food wasted in the United States. We leverage data and innovation to identify inefficiencies throughout the food supply chain and highlight economic opportunities to reduce food waste. Our mission is to motivate and mobilize a diverse set of stakeholders across the food system to activate solutions to U.S. food waste. We work with food businesses, capital providers, solution providers, policymakers, government agencies, academia, the media, you name it, we work with them. And it's our vision to create a thriving food system that optimizes resource use, water, land, labor, energy, fertilizer, as well as one that minimizes climate impacts and enhances food security. As many of you may know, food waste is an issue that predates the COVID-19 pandemic. In the pre-COVID era, 40% of food produced for human consumption was going to waste in the United States. And this food waste happens at every point in the supply chain from farm to consumer. And it has critical implications for food security, economic development, and climate change. One way to think about food waste is that our food system has been operating at a rate of 40% inefficiency. And to put it lightly, that's just completely bonkers and something that's unacceptable. In addition to the good food going to waste, also wasting the water, the land, the energy, the fertilizer, the labor used to produce, transport, process, cook, and ultimately manage the waste of that food. All the while, there are serious climate consequences and impacts on the environment. The good news is that this is solvable. It will take an all-hands-on approach, but it can be done. And food waste prevention alone has been cited as the #1 global solution to climate change. We have an opportunity to preserve our resources, protect the environment, create economic opportunities, and ultimately build a more efficient and equitable food system. So how has this changed since the COVID pandemic started? As you may have picked up from the news or witnessed in your own experience going to the grocery store, COVID has seriously disrupted and exacerbated pre-existing challenges within our food system. We've watched millions of pounds of crops being plowed under, while mere blocks away, people are waiting in miles-long lines for food assistance. So at the onset of COVID, ReefEd conducted a landscape analysis of how the pandemic was and could impact our food system. We're actively conducting analysis to try and quantify the food waste impacts it has created to date. We hosted or participated in over 20 meetings and webinars and conducted a qualitative survey with stakeholders representing the breadth of the food system and all of the stakeholders within it. And we've also been monitoring data on food insecurity and joblessness and unemployment, as that has a serious impact on the food waste situation. As of a couple of weeks ago, over 17 million Americans are newly food insecure. Food assistance agencies have seen demand increase 3- to 5-fold, with on average 60 to 75% of the clients they serve visiting for the first time. These are astounding numbers, and it goes on to highlight the seriousness of this pandemic's impact on our food system. So let's turn to what we've learned through this analysis. At a high level, there are 4 key themes that have emerged that we're keeping our eye on. First, with the abrupt closure of food service, restaurants, and hospitality, this has led to an excess of food upstream in the supply chain, much of which may or already has gone to waste. This is due to shelter-in-place orders, event cancellations, school and business closures across the country. Second, e-commerce has seen exponential growth. This could have interesting long-term implications for waste reduction. We've yet to see how this will ultimately pan out and how solutions will evolve and adapt to address this new world that we live in. Third, the food assistance organizations that are working to get food recovered and to those who need it will need more food than is available to be donated, meaning they need money to make purchases. It's also important to note that the burden of moving that food, be that harvesting, processing, transporting, packing it, often falls to these food assistance organizations. And then fourth and finally, food is a high priority right now, but waste is low. This could have some interesting implications for packaging for years to come, especially as consumer-facing businesses and food assistance organizations adopt new food safety protocols in the midst of COVID. So then let's take a walk through the food system and talk about some of the impacts that we're seeing at each level. So starting with the farm, we've seen huge waste increases as demand drops due to restaurant closures, flight cancellations, cruise cancellations, and so on. In just a really small set of anecdotes, we've seen in Florida alone, 1 million pounds of green beans, 4 million pounds of cabbages, 10 million pounds of tomatoes being tilled under because there were no cruises or restaurants to sell to. The rise of e-commerce is also affecting farms as farmers and consumers look for alternate channels to sell and buy food products. Farmers are having to adapt to new ways of doing businesses, but we're also seeing solutions emerge to meet these needs of farmers and consumers alike, although there's no one silver bullet. So there's a lot of navigating for farmers to do to understand how to use these new resources and oftentimes adapting to just a new landscape that they aren't traditionally working within. We are also seeing a potential supply risk due to farm labor shortage from immigration restrictions, COVID-19 itself, social distancing, or potentially all of the above. As we near the beginning of new planting seasons, less labor could mean less planting and lower yields, leading to less or pricier food this summer and later this year. And this could be further impacted by fewer imports if other countries are having similar problems. And then finally, with the closure of farmers markets across the country, it's been very difficult for smaller farmers to find outlets and markets for their food products. We hope this starts to change as states and cities are beginning to reopen, and hopefully those farmers markets along with them. So moving on to processors and manufacturers, they've been really also impacted by food getting stuck farther up in the supply chain. At the onset of COVID, they saw 2 to 3 times the normal demand from grocery retailers. This has largely leveled out in most places, but there's still a lot of volatility that's predicted to come. Social distance and employee illnesses could and have affected production. PepsiCo closed its Frito-Lay site in California, along with some Quaker Oat production lines in Iowa. We've also seen many meat production and packing facilities close down after employees have contracted the COVID virus. We've also seen some processors and manufacturers shifting production to fight the pandemic. For instance, we've seen beverage alcohol makers switch over to making hand sanitizer. And then we're also seeing upcyclers experiencing input shortages if and as processors stop or change their production lines. And upcyclers are organizations who use byproduct or other surplus products from a normal production line to create other value-added products. Distributors have probably the simplest challenge that they're facing in terms of number of challenges. For them, the big one is surplus food that's left in warehouses due to canceled orders. In just one very small example, United Airlines canceled an order of over 40,000 cheese trays, and the distributor was stuck figuring out how to either sell those to another outlet, donate them, or ultimately make a decision to waste them. So we're seeing this happen to a lot of distributors where they're struggling to move food in warehouses. Oftentimes this is also impacted by sell-by or coded dates on those food products. Retail, as many of us have probably witnessed in our own experiences going out to the grocery store, has seen some really interesting and unique challenges. There were huge demand surges at the onset of COVID. For instance, Kroger saw a 30% increase in sales in March, and that has resulted in fewer donations to food banks. E-commerce is also affecting retail, which has spiked as consumers stay home due to shelter-in-place orders. And many retailers, along with restaurants and other operations, have either shifted to or expanded curbside pickup and delivery, of which those retailers are struggling to fill orders because of the high demand. We've also seen volumes in terms of both food and labor shifting from food service to retail. On the labor side, and just one example, Albertsons has been partnering with the food and hospitality industry to hire 30,000 part-time associates from Hilton, MGM, Regional Cinemas, and other food service outlets. And we're also seeing food product shift from food service to retail supply lines. And this often comes with the need to repack or otherwise rehandle the food so that it's in quantities or sizes that consumers are used to buying at the retail level. We're also seeing a lot of expected volatility in sales. While we have started to see demand and supply start to level out at the retail level, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's to come, especially as states begin to reopen, as people predict that we might have additional peaks in the virus and so on. This makes it incredibly difficult to forecast and plan ahead, and could ultimately lead to more surplus and waste. And then finally, we're seeing a potential long-term shift toward an increased eating at home. So on the restaurant and food service side, again, at the beginning of COVID, we saw one-time or one-off food surpluses as a result of shelter-in-place orders. This has resulted in a wide variety of foods being donated, in some cases preserved, and in a lot of cases wasted. We've also seen, similar to the grocery retail and their curbside pickups, operations shifting to dine out or takeaway only. And we've also seen a lot of closures. It's predicted that many restaurants will stay closed and that mass closures are ultimately likely. The James Beard Foundation launched a relief fund in early March. They had the fund application portal open for 3 hours and received more than 4,200 application requests for micro grants to restaurants, which shows just a glimpse into the amount of need that's being seen by these types of operators. And then probably on a more inspiring note, we've seen a lot of changeovers from restaurants switching to community kitchens, making meals for the food insecure and health workers. So this has been a really inspiring and wonderful thing to watch. It not only gets food to those who need it, but in many cases, it's also providing an opportunity to rehire laid off or furloughed workers. And then finally, at our homes, consumers are also seeing an impact. At the beginning of COVID, again, waste increases are likely, and those still might be to come due to bulk buying behaviors. We saw a lot of folks stocking up, kind of hunkering down for the quarantine, as well as an increase in home cooking. A lot of people who aren't used to cooking at home are starting to do so now, or doing so in with greater increase than they used to. This could result in more inedible parts, unconsumed leftovers, or simply spoilage in past date products because people purchased more than they needed. But we also think that more cooking could lead to increased grocery demand and over time improve skills and less waste in the future. This is a particularly unique time and opportunity where we have a largely captive audience at home who's cooking more than ever. So there's a really great opportunity for increased consumer education at this time to help people understand how to use that food, whether that's how to store it, how to cook it, how to integrate it into delicious leftovers, and then ultimately how to manage what's left over at the end. So in addition to this landscape assessment of the broader food system, we also took a deeper dive into what's happening in the food recovery sector, where organizations are rescuing and redistributing food to those in need. And on the screen, you'll see just a few highlights of direct quotes from that analysis that highlight some of the challenge that we're hearing from frontline operators. And these fall into a handful of categories, including sporadic and drastic peaks in donations as businesses close, as they reopen, as supply and demand shifts and fluctuates. We continue to see fewer donations from the grocery retail sector, which is a place where many food rescue organizations have relied on donations for years and sometimes decades. We're seeing an overall decline in the consistency of donations. And then in turn, this inconsistency is incredibly difficult to manage. Food recovery organizations are oftentimes very nimble and flexible, willing to work with what they've got. but this time in particular has been particularly chaotic, and food organizations are struggling to keep up, or in many cases working in complete overdrive to do so. There are also shortages of funding, food, labor, and transport available to move food as people have gone into shelter in place, as folks have feared for their health and have been staying at home. Volunteer labor largely runs these organizations, and that workforce is no longer available. And then they're also experiencing, as I've mentioned, the inconsistencies in donations. And then finally, in response to all of this, organizations are pivoting their operations as much as they can to adjust to and accommodate the changing supply and demand. Some are figuring out how to take full truckloads of single commodities off of the farms. Some are figuring out how to manage and repack food destined for the food service sector. And some are coming up with really creative ideas to solve the transportation logistic challenges, leveraging technology, leveraging idle assets, and so on to get food where it needs to go. And so within this analysis, we looked at the 3 core stakeholders who work across the food emergency system. So that's food donors, donation recipients, and then other stakeholders being other food recovery or waste prevention organizations, nonprofits, education organizations, and so on. And for food donors, the most common challenge we heard was food transport, followed by cold storage, labor, and coordination. And coordination means, a lack of information or best practice sharing on what should be done with surplus food, when, where, and by whom. So generally understanding how to navigate the system. For donation recipients, the most common challenge we saw was also food transport, followed by funding, food shortages, labor, and cold storage. And for other stakeholders, the most common challenge we saw was funding, followed by labor, food shortages, and food transport. So what are we doing about all of this? Obviously, there's an enormous amount of work to be done, and the really positive news is there are hundreds, possibly several thousand organizations working across the food system to address this challenge now. Many of them are expanding their services. Many of them are pivoting. They're piloting new ideas. They're leveraging mobile pop-ups and food delivery, creative last mile delivery solutions, and more to make sure that our neighbors are not struggling. And ReefEd in particular, we've taken a 3-pronged approach to how we're addressing the problem, which falls into 3 buckets of data insights and communication, financing, and food systems projects. So within data insights and communications, just like we've done on this webinar today, we're trying to continue to provide leading guidance and information to everyone across the sector on what types of food are being wasted, how it can be managed, and what each of us can do about it to address the problem. We hosted a 5-part webinar series primarily for food recovery organizations, covering labor, logistics, food safety, government, and finance. And we've also been working hard to make sure this stays in the headlines. There's a lot of noise out there with everything going on with COVID and beyond, and we want to make sure that our nation doesn't lose sight of this tremendous problem and the opportunities to solve it. On the financing side, we have successfully launched a $1 million fund called the ReefEd COVID-19 Food Waste Solutions Fund, where we're granting 100% of the money that we've raised to organizations working on the front lines to fight food waste and hunger. To date, we've issued almost $400,000 in grants to 11 organizations. We launched the fund with an initial goal of rescuing 10 million pounds of food. With less than half of the funds dispersed, we're already on track to well exceed that goal and are really inspired by the organizations that we've gotten to know and are able to support through this work. And then finally, we have food systems projects. So we're looking to the future, both near and long term, to ensure we reset and rebuild the food system in a sustainable way that mitigates waste. Just 2 projects within that I'll highlight. One's called the Harvest Rescue Project, in collaboration with many food service operations, including hotels and distributors, as well as some other nonprofits and industry associations, to leverage idle assets and generally move food from the farms to consumers We started this with an initial focus on the Southeast. We also have some work going on in New York City. In New York, we are inventorying idle assets, particularly around cold storage, to understand where food can be stored and then distributed from. And in another project, we're actively finding a home for 2 billion pounds of potatoes that would otherwise be getting plowed under. We're also looking at food business reopenings for the restaurant and food service sectors in collaboration with James Beard Foundation and a few others to provide guidance for these businesses as they reopen so that they also don't lose sight of the opportunity to be preventing food waste and be running sustainable operations in addition to the other challenges they'll be facing as they return. In the world beyond COVID, fingers crossed that we get there soon. We know that there will still be a lot of work to do around food waste. There might be more to do as a result of COVID, but either way, there is going to be work to be done, and we're continuing to move forward with efforts to provide data-driven solutions to the rest of the sector. And one exciting project that I'm really excited to share with you guys is called the Reef Insights Engine. The Insights Engine will be released this fall and will be a data center for all things food waste. This tool is going to combine over 50 public and proprietary data sets in a way that's never been done before to more accurately quantify the amount of food going to waste, why it's happening, where it's happening, and the solutions available to address it, as well as who needs to take action, what type of policies need to be in place to create an enabling environment, and where's that funding and financing going to come from. So through the resources and web tools that we'll be releasing this fall, we'll be taking users on a journey from awareness, some who might need to learn about food waste from the first time, all the way to implementing solutions, knowing who they need to work with, and ultimately being able to calculate and document their impact. This has been a labor of love over many years and builds upon the work of the 2016 roadmap to reduce US food waste by 20%. And we look forward to working with dozens of stakeholders across the food system over the next few months to start doing user testing and collecting stakeholder feedback. And we're also really happy to be collaborating with a wide variety of incredible organizations, including Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, in the development of these resources, and look forward to sharing more as we have it to share. So encourage everyone to check out covid.refed.com. You can find more information about the specific work that we're doing. You can see our truly incredible grantees that we're working with through the COVID-19 Food Waste Solutions Fund. And we also have a great host of resources, whether you want to know how to address food waste yourself as a consumer, or you work at a different point throughout the supply chain and are curious about how you can get involved. And you're also more than welcome to contact me directly if you have any questions, and look forward to continuing the conversation today as well.
Thank you, Katie. That was a great presentation. We're going to shift now to Arielle.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen? Okay. Hi, everyone. Okay, just wanted to check. So thank you, Katie, for that really comprehensive overview of food waste and food recovery during COVID. That was really amazing to learn everything you all have been finding. And thank you, Terry and Lynn, for the introduction, and NERC and NEWMOA for hosting this webinar and enabling us to have this really important conversation today. And finally, thank you to everyone for joining this webinar. So, as you heard, my name is Ariel Ardura. I am a clinical fellow at the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, where I focus on our food waste and food recovery portfolio. And today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about date labeling, which is one of the issues that we focus on, and where we've seen some movements. I want to update you all there. And then I'm going to pivot and talk more about policy issues and solutions related specifically to COVID-19. So just to give you a little bit more information about FLPC, we are an action learning program. We provide legal and policy advice to nonprofits, government agencies, entrepreneurs, and other organizations on a range of food policy questions. And we also educate students at the law school about the role of law and policy in the food system. So our work focuses on several areas. Our biggest and sort of oldest is our work on reducing food waste, but we also work on issues around community food systems, food access and nutrition, and sustainable food production. With regard to food waste and food recovery specifically, these are some of the sort of policy levers that we focus on. And we found that law impacts food waste in a few key ways. So food is heavily regulated, from food production, transportation, distribution, sale. There are a lot of regulations, and these regulations are related to food safety, misbranding, adulteration, innovation, trade, environment, systemic issues, etc. And law can really act as a disincentive, either because of confusion over the laws, or maybe they're not clear, or because the law itself is actually serving as a barrier. But policies and laws can also provide incentives or drive changes in habits. And so we think strategically about how to use policy development to reduce those barriers and increase the incentives in order to reduce waste. We receive hundreds of emails and phone calls per year to help answer legal questions by donor businesses, by food banks or food rescue organizations, as well as policymakers at all levels of government, asking for advice to help make it easier to donate. And we also try to help coordinate and drive policy conversations about how to reduce food waste, which is generally through our public reports and resources. So Katy gave a great overview of the issue of food waste, but I just wanted to point out that this issue is really a global one, but where North America differs from the rest of the world is that it's the only region where waste is greater than loss. And so just to clarify, loss applies to food that is discarded during the production, processing, and manufacturing of food or beverages prior to consumption, whereas waste applies to food discarded during distribution, retail, food service, at the household level, as well as during redistribution. So as I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about date labeling, which is an issue that we've focused on for a long time and where we have seen some movement recently. So our work in this area all started with a client over 10 years ago who wanted to sell past date foods at low price. This was Daily Table in Massachusetts. They heard they couldn't do it. It turned out, as we learned, that they could, but that there were some restrictions. But that got us sort of thinking and looking into, what other states were doing. And as we, looked around the country, we found that there were huge variations in date labeling across states. And so we ended up doing a full report on the topic with NRDC called The Dating Game. So some of the problems with the system, a major one is that many people believe that date labels affixed to food products are indicators of safety, and so they'll throw the food away once the date has passed. However, in spite of this belief, for the vast majority of foods, date labels indicate freshness or quality rather than food safety. So a big part of the problem is the lack of federal standardization, the lack of clarity on what date labels mean, and the differing laws among states. So in the US, 41 states require date labels on some products, and 20 states restrict sales and or donation of products after the date label has passed. And Reef, who as Katie mentioned, we work with on a lot of these issues, has found that a standardized date labeling system is the most cost-effective of 27 solutions to reduce food waste. It could eliminate 398,000 tons of waste and provide 1.8 billion in economic value. So, it's a really something that we would really like to see, and luckily we have seen some progress in recent years. The Food Marketing Institute and the Consumer Brands Association, formerly known as the Grocery Manufacturers Association, recently created a voluntary date label standard for industry that recommends that companies use the phrase "best if used by" to indicate food quality concerns when food has passed its labeled date, and then "used by" to indicate safety concerns. And that that food should therefore be discarded. The problem is that it's a voluntary standard, and so companies are not required to comply, and it's not universal. Some may use labels incorrectly, and in over half of the states, there are state laws that are in direct conflict with the language, with the standard. So for example, Montana requires milk to have a sell-by date and a pasteurized date. Indiana requires eggs to be labeled with an expiration date preceded by the letters EXP or sell-by. 8 states require date labels related to manufacturer's process, which is unrelated to freshness or safety. 5 states require multiple dates on packages, and 11 states prohibit the sale of food past a quality date. So, that's why we think it's really important to have a standardized date labeling system at the federal level. And we have seen some movement. Shelley Pingree, a representative from Maine in Congress, has introduced legislation that would standardize date labels. She first introduced the Food Date Labeling Act in July 2019, and then the same language was used in her recently introduced Agriculture Resilience Act, which was introduced this past February. So the standard labels would be optional, but if a label was used, it would have to use one of the following terms: best if used by to indicate quality, used by to indicate that the food has a safety concern and should be discarded. So same as the FMI and Consumer Brands Association standard. It also bans states from prohibiting sale or donation of foods past quality dates and requires FDA and or USDA to provide consumer education on what date labels mean. There are also some other food waste provisions in the Agricultural Resilience Act, but for the sake of time, I am not going to go into those today. But we're really hopeful that this date labeling standardization language could be included in upcoming appropriations bills or future COVID response legislation, and we are keeping a close eye on it. So now I want to turn to talking about food waste during COVID-19. So one of the biggest issues right now is that supply chains are down. Food is stuck on farms, really for any food that would sell normally into the commercial or hospitality sector. This is true for massive national producers as well as local and regional producers. And USDA has, not necessarily acted quickly enough to sort of rectify some of these issues. And food waste is senseless always, but it's particularly senseless now, as we're seeing so many, families going hungry, and there's really new funding that's needed. So we think that now is a particularly good time to pass policies aimed at reducing food waste. So what is the federal government doing? There's TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program. Through phase 2 and 3 congressional relief packages, USDA was allocated an additional $850 million for TFAP. So the Families First Act provided 400 million, 300 million of which was for TFAP food purchases, and then 100 million was for storing and distributing food. And this was in addition to previously existing TFAP funds. So TFAP entitlement purchases are distributed to states based on a specific funding allocation formula. And during an emergency situation like COVID-19, there are flexibilities available to TFAP state agencies, which are usually food banks, through state plan amendments to assist them in continuing to provide food to people who need it. And these include income eligibility, address collection, signatures, distribution models that accommodate social distancing. So through the CARES Act also provided funding. 16 billion went to commodity supports through the Commodity Credit Corporation, and 9.5 billion was allocated for dairy, specialty crops, and ranchers. The 16 billion in commodity supports went to the USDA Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, and that program also received 3 billion for distributors to submit bids to procure, pack, and deliver foods to a nonprofit. Some of the issues with the USDA programs are that they've been sort of slow to ramp up and provide that funding or provide food purchases, and also that they typically buy shelf stable because the food takes so long to move that they really don't buy a lot of fresh produce. Another area where the federal government is acting is through FEMA. So the majority of federal financial disaster assistance is made available through FEMA. And under FEMA, states and municipalities can apply for financial assistance for feeding activities, which include purchasing, packaging, and/or preparing food, delivering food, including hot and cold meals if necessary, when conditions constitute a level of severity that food is not easily accessible for purchase, and finally, leasing, distribution, and storage space, vehicles, and necessary equipment. So some states have started to take advantage of the FEMA funding. For example, California has a new program using FEMA money to purchase food from restaurants to give to those in need. But there's generally sort of a lot of confusion about the guidance and process, and it's just not entirely clear what states and municipalities have to do to get this funding and what they're allowed to do with it. Some of the other changes we've seen have been some flexibilities around food safety laws. So now sales of food products are allowed without the nutrition facts panel. FDA has released guidance on food safety during COVID-19. FDA has also relaxed its egg safety rule. So it now allows shell egg producers to sell directly to retail rather than having to go through further processing. And there's some flexibility on packaging requirements. And then there's new CDC guidance on safety in meat processing. So what are some of the policy solutions that we're thinking about? One thing we'd like to see is more funding to purchase and distribute food. So this could include more funding from USDA. For example, if the purchase and distribution program is successful, they'll need to scale that up and they'll need more funding for that. Another possibility is providing funding through TFAP directly to states to make in-state purchases from producers. So, normally the way it works with TFAP is that the USDA purchases food from producers. So this would allow states to make those purchases, and ideally the focus would be on purchasing from struggling producers. And then finally, block grants to states to purchase food for needy families. we're also advocating for tax benefits to incentivize donation and offset some of the costs of donation. So we know that cost is one of the main barriers to donating food. Labor, transportation, on-site storage, all these things cost money, as Katy pointed out in her presentation. And oftentimes it makes more sense to throw food away or plow under rather than donate. And food recovery organizations are especially struggling with the cost of transporting donated food right now, which you saw in the last presentation. So one thing we'd like to see is an expanded enhanced deduction, tax deduction to cover food provided at a low cost. So right now there's an enhanced tax deduction specifically for the donation of food. And in order to be eligible for this tax deduction, the requirements for the donor are that the recipient must be a 501c3 nonprofit. The donated food must be used for the care of the ill, needy, or infants. The donated food must be distributed free of charge to the ultimate recipient. There must be a written statement to the donor, and the food must be in compliance with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. And the deduction is capped at 15% of the donor's taxable income. So we'd like to see an expanded enhanced deduction for food donation that would cover low-cost sales of donated food, just enough to cover the cost of handling and administering the food. This would allow organizations to be flexible and innovative in finding ways to offset the cost of getting donated food to people who need it. We know, for example, that 412 Food Rescue has said that if they could charge $1 for the meals they're providing, they could greatly expand their operations. We'd also like to see a tax incentive that covers the transportation costs for donated food. So transporting donated food requires a vehicle, sometimes one with refrigeration, a driver, gas, as well as other vehicle maintenance and repair expenses. So in a normal world, this can be quite costly, and COVID-19 is, of course, putting even more pressure on the capacity of food recovery organizations to recover and distribute food. So we're advocating for a tax incentive aimed specifically at offsetting costs of transportation. And this would be aimed at donors, trucking and logistics companies, as well as farmers. And then finally, we'd like to see an alternative tax credit specifically for farmers who donate food that they could opt for instead of an enhanced deduction. So farmers usually don't make enough to benefit from the federal enhanced deduction. They are, particularly struggling, as we've seen right now, to get their produce off their fields, and they're looking for alternate distribution channels. And so we think that farmers could benefit. We'd like to see a tax credit which would enable farmers to benefit no matter how much they make. So those are sort of the tax incentives that we are currently advocating for. And then finally, we'd like the federal government to address some of the barriers to food donation and create more flexibilities. So this could include clarifying and expanding liability protections for donated food. There is currently a bill in the Senate that was introduced last fall that would expand liability protections to cover low-cost sales of food, as well as direct donations of food, so that the food doesn't have to go through a nonprofit in order to qualify for liability protection. And this would only be for certain qualified direct donors, like schools and restaurants, which already have to go through food safety training, as well as farms. We would also like to see funds provided for the transportation of donated food, and particularly for last mile delivery, which we know has been a particular issue for food rescue organizations. We would like the government to ensure awareness of food safety modifications for commercial sector sales. And then another issue we've found is that well, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition found that there could be 1 billion lost for farmers in sales which would normally go through direct markets like farmers markets. And so one of the policies that we're advocating for is providing funding through the local agriculture marketing program for technology and mobile operations for farmers markets. And then finally, increasing SNAP benefits and expanding online sales. So we're working with members of Congress to try and get some of these policy solutions into COVID legislation, as well as putting together different resources related to coronavirus food systems issues, all of which you can find on our COVID-19 response page. I encourage you to check that out, and please reach out if you have any thoughts or any questions, and I'm looking forward to all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arielle. That was a lot to cover, and it was a great presentation. And we do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to start off trying to get to as many of them as we possibly can. And I'm going to see about directing them to either one of the presenters. Katy, I think this is a question for you because it goes back to your presentation. What does it mean when the crop was, quote, tilled under, end quote, when not sold? Katy, you have to unmute.
Okay, sorry. Try to unmute myself. So when a crop's been tilled under, that usually means that a farmer hasn't been able to find a market for it, and the cost to harvest and then try to do something else with that food is greater than the cost to simply plow the food back into the ground. While this isn't ultimately the worst place for food to end up, tilling it under does put nutrients back in the soil as opposed to rotting in the landfill and producing methane. However, it was still a huge waste of food because so much has already gone into produce and grow that food, and it's ready to be picked. So it simply means that that crop's been tilled or plowed back into the ground instead of being harvested, and often because the cost and economics don't work to pick it.
Thanks, Katy. The next question may be also for you. Can you give us an example of a, quote, upcycled, end quote, food product?
Yeah, happy to. So I'll give you two of my personal favorites that I usually have in my home. One is called an organization called Bar Nana, and what they do is they rescue bananas that are left at ports that don't get exported, and they process them into really tasty treats. So they have kind of like dried banana snacks, they make some chips out of them and other products. So it's basically taking that, what normally would be a whole banana that you'd peel and eat, and putting it into other tasty treats. Another great example is a company called Renewal Mill. They create alternative flours to typical grain-based flours. So they're taking, for instance, coffee cherries, and grinding that into a flour that can then be used as a replacement. I don't remember the exact ratios, so it's probably not a 1-to-1, but it's something you can use in place of a traditional wheat flour, for instance.
Thanks, Katy. I just wanted to let folks know by now, you should be able to see on the screen now NEWMOA's website and where we've posted the PowerPoint slides that you've seen just now, and we will be posting a recording of this webinar, and I know that NERC will be doing something similar on their website. Next question I wanted to share with you is, and maybe this is for you, Katy, I'm not sure. Do you know what the final decisions of warehouses has been when faced with excess food?
Unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that, and it really varies by warehouse and probably comes down to kind of day-to-day and pallet by pallet decisions. So we're doing the research right now to understand how much of that has gone to waste versus what's been moved on to other markets. So hopefully more to come on that point, but unfortunately don't have kind of a great answer for you other than it really varies.
Okay, thanks. So this question is, I've heard some smaller farmers are now selling to their end consumers. I think you guys addressed this to some extent. Do you believe these transactions will have a big enough impact to drop the price of produce in local areas? And either Arielle or Katy, if you want to take that. Go ahead, Katy.
Happy to start. I'd say at the scale that it's happening today, probably not. There's a pretty big, onboarding curve and switch in kind of normal business as usual operations to start doing those types of transactions. So we're seeing some great solutions come online and, to pivot to be able to provide that type of service and infrastructure for farmers. But I'd say it's not at a scale yet to date that's such that it's going to make a big enough difference to impact prices.
Okay, thanks. I think this question maybe is for Arielle. Do Good Samaritan laws encompass prepared food in every state, overproduction from restaurants, for example?
Yes, they do. So there's the federal law, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act, which covers prepared food so long as it goes to a nonprofit and is delivered to the ultimate recipient for free. And then some state laws go above and beyond those protections. But yes, at sort of the baseline federal level, that is covered.
So this is sort of a two-part question for Katy. Does ReFed collaborate with the Food Recovery Network? And is ReFed working with community-based food recovery programs like Helping Hands?
Great question. So we are very familiar with Food Recovery Network. I don't think we've done any formal partnership with the organization, but track them in our innovator database and know that they're doing great work. And then in terms of the way we work with some more local or regional organizations on the ground, we also uplift those through the resources that we produce, including our long-standing innovator database. We have some new resources, including a funding directory of organizations that are looking in need of financing right now, specific to COVID. And we do often look at places where if we're operating at a national level, how can we bring in local or regional folks who often have more knowledge than we do about an area that we're working in. So just one example would be a project that we're part of called the Pacific Coast Collaborative, where we're working with 14 or so jurisdictions across the Pacific Coast. We'll be taking a very large regional approach to initiative to reduce food waste, but through that initiative, we'll likely be pulling in a lot of more local players who have the intimate knowledge of what it takes to move food in, in their city, in their county, and so on.
So I'm going to do sort of a two-part question because the two questions are kind of related. Are there any policy efforts around education and clarification of food dating? And I assume that means food date labeling. So much food gets thrown away because even the most educated people, including my PhD spouse, think dates on food products instruct them when they should be thrown out because they are no longer safe. And the second part of this question is, can you put together a date label guideline for kids? My daughter routinely refuses to eat anything past the date on the label, no matter how much I explain the nuances of date labels. I think this is for Arielle. Go ahead.
So I love that idea of a date labeling guide for kids. I think that that could certainly be done that's sort of out of the scope of work that we do. But if anyone wanted to take on creating that sort of guide and just explaining that most of these labels don't mean anything that are not related to food safety. There is, so USDA and FDA both recommend using best if used by to indicate quality. And I think they've got some materials, but there's really not a lot out there at level on what date labels mean. So that's, one of the things that we are pushing for is more sort of like clarification and a consumer education campaign to make sure that everyone knows what these different date labels mean.
And I'd just add on, I encourage you to check out savethefood.com. It's a project that I think you guys worked on too, Arielle, but was led by the NRDC around consumer education, and it does include some great resources on date labeling that might be appropriate for both the PhD husband and the child.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Katie, did you want to add anything?
No, that was all.
Okay. Let's see. Could you speak to the coordination of efforts between the USDA, e.g. Hunger Hotline, and EPA, e.g. Excess Food Opportunities Map, Food Too Good to Waste, and other federal, state, and local efforts? Either one of you, I guess.
So I don't know how much coordination is going on there. So recently, EPA, USDA, and FDA launched their sort of interagency food waste reduction strategy, but it's not clear what exactly is being done and how much they're talking. So Katie, I don't know if you have any more knowledge about that, but yeah, my guess would be is that they're not coordinating a whole lot.
Yeah, I'd say something similar. A lot of those programs are kind of housed within the same teams at the agencies. And I do know there's a lot of, coordination and dialogue happening behind the scenes in terms of how those specific, resources and programs themselves talk to each other. I don't think that's been probably figured out the best way that it could so far. So there's probably just more opportunity for those to be more closely integrated, and for programs like the Food Waste Opportunities, Excess Opportunities Map, and Food Too Good to Waste to be linked together. It's a great question.
Okay, thanks. What about slightly dented cans at food banks? I volunteered at one and they had us throw away anything that had even the slightest dent. I mean, I understand significant can damage, but I felt there was so much food waste due to a slight dent that didn't puncture the can. Have you spoken to the food banks about this issue?
So we know that it might be that the food bank thinks of it as a food safety concern, or that they believe that that's prohibited by, state or local law, food safety laws. And so that's definitely, it's definitely a problem. It might be that it's just not clear at the federal level and at most state levels what laws that food banks or food donors, food donees need to be in compliance with. So there are laws in food safety legislation that aren't actually specifically related to food safety, like things that, dented cans can't be sold or things like that. And I think it's just not clear that whether or not those laws apply to food donation, basically. So generally, I think that's fine, and I'm not sure what the specific reasoning at the food bank was there, but it might have just been sort of a confusion around what laws they needed to be in compliance with.
And I just add that we see food banks or other food service agents, food assistance organizations do it both ways. So we've definitely seen and worked with some who take that same approach where they have maybe it's that extra precaution around food safety or whether it's legitimate or not. But we also do work with some who rescue dented cans as part of their strategy and get those back to the food system. So I think, like Arielle said, it really comes down to the individual food bank and how they handle that from an policy standpoint.
Okay, I think this question is for Arielle. Where can I read up on laws regarding food donation in my state? I'm in California.
That's a great question. Well, we have a number of reports. We published a number of reports on sort of food donation in a variety of areas, and one of our reports is keeping food out of the landfill, which is sort of a toolkit for states and state and local governments. And we definitely bring up California numerous times in that report and highlight some of, I think that California has done some great work and is pretty progressive in that area. So you can find some of that there. Other than that, I might try looking into California's like environmental agency resources. They might have something, or whatever agency handles food and agriculture. You might be able to find some good resources there.
I'd also encourage you to check out Reef-Ed's Food Waste Policy Finder. It's, I'd say, like 100% powered by the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic team, but there's a map there and you can click on California and you can look at the breadth of policies. I would just emphasize that this doesn't include pending legislation at this time. So these are past laws, but it gives a pretty decent overview of what's there. And then you can see the law, the regulation titles, and that way you can do kind of further research on them if you need to.
Yeah, sorry about that. That is definitely the best place to look. It's an amazing resource and definitely where you should go first.
Terry, we can't hear you. You're muted. Aha. Yes, hi.
Hi. Do you want me to make you the presenter and you can show the NERC website and where you'll be posting the information on this webinar?
Well, it will be on our homepage. So
Okay.
I don't think we need to mess with the presenter stuff, but thank you.
Okay, great. So the next question is, none of the piles of food has not been distributed for retail or other consumption represent waste if the food is recycled either by tilling it back into the soil or composting it into soil amendment to restore the nutrients and biological activity to soil. So I guess it's a comment, but I didn't know if you guys wanted to comment.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. I guess it's a comment about the term food waste and what's included in it. But it's, the commenter said none of the piles of food that has not been distributed for retail or other consumption represent waste if the food is recycled either by tilling it back into soil or composting it into a soil amendment to restore the nutrients and biological activity to the soils.
Oh yeah, so I think I spoke to that. So that would be food loss. That would be considered food loss, not food waste. Sort of at the pre-consumer level, that's all loss. So yeah, you're right. It is restoring nutrients, but it's also sort of a loss to farmers in terms of all the labor and financial resources that went into producing the food. So as Katie said, it's not the worst scenario, but we would also like them to be compensated for the food that they grow.
And I'll also just add, and I think Ariel had this towards the beginning of her presentation, the EPA has a really great resource called the Food Recovery Hierarchy, or you might know it as the inverted triangle, but you see kind of the best and highest uses of food, with the first one kind of maybe an easy guess is getting that food to people. So part of it is also, I agree with your comment, it definitely not particularly waste or even the worst place for it to end up. But we do like to think through that hierarchy in terms of feeding people first, and then kind of moving down the hierarchy to, feeding animals, feeding the land, and then there are certainly pieces that will still end up in landfill, which is where we don't want it to go.
So have there been any studies about how to change perceptions about food waste, i.e. tendencies for over-serving and over-preparing of food because of cultural desire to appear, quote, generous or rich, end quote, similar to what I've heard about grocery stores overstocking to make everything appear super abundant and willing to throw out what doesn't sell?
That's a really fantastic question. So the short answer is yes, there has been. However, behavior change is very challenging and usually happens at a slow pace, regardless of whether that's consumer behavior change or behavior change within the industry. We and many others have been putting out guidance like that around topics like smaller plates, how to better manage in-store displays, proper portion sizes. Since 1970, our portion sizes have nearly tripled across most food products. There's some interesting facts about that out of NRDC, including how big cookies have grown, for instance. But all of that to say that there has been work around that. It's moving relatively slow, and I think what we'll be looking for, especially on the industry side, when it comes to how grocery stores are stocked or how restaurants serve food, we really need some first movers who are willing to prioritize, food waste and food security and the other things that come along with reducing food waste, and be willing to make a change to how they're presenting themselves. But that requires a lot of work. It requires oftentimes taking a risk and trusting that your consumers will still follow and be excited by what you're presenting them with. And just takes some hard work and time, but we'd love for someone to raise their hand and say, let me design the grocery store of the future, or let me design the restaurant of the future that doesn't have any waste.
Thanks, Katie. I think this is a question for what is the benefit in blocking grants to states to purchase food for the needy?
What is the benefit?
Of blocking grants to states to purchase food for the needy.
Like block grants?
And I don't know if it means, yeah, I don't know if that's what it's talking.
Block grants? I'm gonna go with that because I don't think there would be any benefit to blocking grants. So the benefit would be that states sort of know their, food systems best, and they know where the food needs to go. They know where it needs to, where they need to get it from, and sort of giving them funding without having strings attached or anything like that would enable them to be more innovative and flexible in their approaches to feeding people.
Okay, there's a lot of questions here. This is great. So what about resources to encourage more local food production? Providing funds to sustain the current unsustainable model of food production will just sustain the problem. A lot of sustains.
Yeah, that's another great point, and I'd say there's probably more research to be done from a food waste perspective to really kind of prove out the the costs and benefits of how local food production impacts food waste specifically. There's a few snippets of work that's been done here and there, and we generally assume that with those shortened supply chains and presumably some closer community ties and relationships, that those supply chains can be more efficient, as well as just not transporting food across the country. You have fewer opportunities, for loss and spoilage along the way. So there's definitely benefits to that as it relates to food waste, but I'd say there's some more work to be done on the research side to really prove that out so that we can help convince people with kind of in an evidence-based way.
Can I just follow up with a little bit more about my previous response? This is Arielle. So one other benefit, of providing block grants to states is that the money would go directly to them. And so there's not sort of the same, one of the issues we've seen is that USDA has been really slow in getting funding out, and there have been sort of issues rolling out these programs. So this would just go straight to the states and they could get it immediately and do what they need to with it.
Thanks. Thank you, guys. So what are the most important ways to get consumers to change behavior to reduce home food waste?
I'd say to make it, and this probably applies across the supply chain, make it as easy as possible, and try to integrate ways that make people feel like they aren't having to change their normal habits. Because again, consumer change and behavior change is hard. The habits we have around food are really ingrained in how we live, and a lot of times they're culturally ingrained as well. So making it really easy, meeting people where they are, providing tips and tricks that don't add extra time, but actually showing people how they can save time and save money. Usually that financial component is the most compelling. The household of 4 wastes somewhere between $1,400 and $1,600 a year on average, which to some people might not sound like a lot, but on a low income, that's pretty significant in terms of money that you're effectively throwing away. So, meeting people where they are, understanding what might motivate them, and then tailoring messages to, address it from that angle.
Okay, I think I'm going to combine these questions. This is for you, Arielle. Given the current climate, what do you think the chances are that some of the policies that you went through would be enacted? And beyond COVID, will some of these policies become permanent? Seems like national security issues seems like a national security issue to protect our food system.
So that's a great question. We are hopeful. I think everyone can see now that we just need to make getting food to the people who need it as easy as possible, and that includes making food donation as easy as possible. And so we're hopeful that some of these policy solutions will be and can be passed through this Congress. I think especially we're seeing some good momentum around the liability protections and tax incentives. I think everyone can get on board with that, or that's what we're hoping. The idea is in the legislation that we're advocating for is that this would be permanent and it wouldn't just be for COVID-19. And that's true for liability protection, expansion, for tax deductions, for SNAP expansion. I don't know if they would try to sort of make some of those provisions, if they were to pass, to be just a temporary thing. Our hope is that that wouldn't be the case. And then I feel like there's a little part that I missed, the national food security issue. What was that part of the question?
I think it was just a comment.
Okay.
So, the person was saying it seems like it's a national security issue to protect our food system.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So are there particular actions municipalities can take to support this work, especially during this time of COVID? Katie, maybe that's for you to start with.
Sure. I mean, I'd say there's probably a fair bit you could be doing. We're seeing municipalities really step up where federal or larger governmental resources haven't stepped in terms of helping to coordinate and make people aware of what resources are available. So I think similar to the work Reef and Harvard FLPC are doing, creating resources that really speak to your constituencies, talking with them, understanding what challenges they're facing right now. They might be the same as what we've talked about today, but they also might be really unique and tailored based on your specific geographic location. So I'd say, talk to your constituents, listen to the challenges that they're having, but also hear about the ways that they're responding. You probably have dozens or hundreds of organizations working in your municipalities who are actively, rescuing, preventing, and recycling food waste that need your help more than ever right now. So being collaborative with them, understanding their needs, helping them think through if there are idle assets in your municipality that can be leveraged. Maybe you have a convention center or a town hall that's not being used right now that could be converted to a kitchen. Maybe you have restaurants who aren't ready to reopen, but they could be utilizing their space as community kitchens, and they might need some guidance at a municipal level on how to do that properly and safely. And then you could also consider providing space, just like NERC and NEWMOA are doing for us today, for people to talk. There's breakdown and coordination also across the food system right now, and in the best of times. So providing spaces for people to come together, to share best practices, to find opportunities where they could be collaborating and working together, and generally kind of fostering that type of collaborative engagement could be invaluable to the organization on the front lines of COVID.
Okay, so this is another question for you, Katie. In the beginning of your presentation, I think this is a question to clarify something you talked about in your presentation. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that demand for food is up, but waste is down. However, it doesn't seem that way from the rest of your presentation. What did you mean?
So this might have been, I think I know what point you're talking about, so apologies if I'm interpreting this the wrong way. Demand for food is up, or kind of concern around food is very high right now, but concern around waste is low. So I think this was related to the point I made around this could have implications on packaging. So it's not that waste itself is down, but how we're thinking about waste. It's not really taking the forefront. You're even seeing this come through in some policy implications. Like I'm in New York City, and we're might be losing our city composting program because funding isn't available. And I know that's happening in some other places too. So apologies if that was confusing, but it was meant to say that focus on food is high, focus on waste is low.
Thanks for that clarification. Next question is, I hear milk is being dumped. Are there any specific programs to assist dairy farmers lost?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there was funding through the CARES Act, I believe, that was supposed to be that's supposed to go to dairy farmers. So that was 9.5 billion, yeah, through the CARES Act, that going to dairy farmers, specialty crops, and ranchers.
We've also seen a couple of solution providers who are specifically providing solutions to dairy. One that is one of our grantees of the COVID-19 Food Waste Solutions Fund is called Natural Upcycling. They historically had been doing dairy waste to anaerobic digestion, and they actually pivoted their operations to rescue, process, and redistribute dairy products for human consumption. It's a really great and exciting way that we're seeing people kind of adjust how they're working from business as usual to respond to the pandemic. That's just one example, and not happening at a national level, and certainly not at the capacity to meet all of the challenges of the hundreds of millions of gallons of milk that's had to be dumped, but definitely encourage connecting or reading about what National Dairy Farmers Association is doing, and then also recommend checking out Dairy Management Inc. They're also part of the National Dairy Council, because they have some great resources around how to address dairy waste in general, as well as during COVID.
You mentioned now that there's now a huge opportunity for education and outreach to consumers on how to reduce waste at home. Do you have examples of organizations taking advantage of this opportunity?
I don't know of any off the top of my head. At the national level, we aren't seeing that, really be capitalized on yet. And I can't really speak to what's happening at the more local or regional levels. We're actually about to launch a project just to do a landscape assessment to understand what is happening there. So again, hopefully some more information to come. But I'd hope and fingers crossed that there's some stuff happening at local and regional levels too that we just aren't aware of yet.
So are there any statistics that identify what the most urgent food safety issues are? I think this is a question for you, Arielle, meaning are, quote, expiration dates really, quote, saving people from getting sick? It seems like the worst issues with food safety are harvesting, processing problems such as E. coli, salmonella, et cetera, and not from drinking spoiled milk or hummus that's past the date.
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's right on point. Expiration dates, date labels really do not, for the most part, indicate safety concerns. They're really about the quality of the food, and they're really primarily, indicators for, grocers and distributors about when they should discard the food. And so, yeah, that's not a big food safety concern. I think the ones that you noted are much bigger food safety concerns. There are, a few food products for which there is a food safety concern after a certain point. And so that's why we're advocating for this standardized date labeling system that would have two different labels, and one would be an indicator of the food's quality maybe not being at its best past a certain date, and then the other label, ideally used by, would indicate that there is in fact a food safety concern and that the food should be discarded past that date.
So I'm going to jump to we only have time for a few more questions. I'm going to jump to a question about how do we provide culturally relevant, fresh and healthy food to folks most disinvested in the system, including low income and people of color, indigenous people. Canned food isn't healthy. And then the next question, are cans dented on the side safe, and can cans dented at the seam pose a problem?
So I'm happy to jump in on the first part of that. I'd say the real answer there is by working with local or regional solutions providers. They often know their neighbors the best. They know where they're coming from. They know what they're used to eating. They know what's going, if you get a farm to family box, for instance, those people are going to know how to adjust it and how to pack it so that the foods that get to their neighbor are foods they're going to want to eat, that they're going to know how to work with, and so on. So it's really making sure that food distribution efforts are led by local parties, and that everyone gets a voice at a table about what's being delivered to them, so to speak, and making sure that they're represented in that. I completely agree with you that that's a really important component of food recovery efforts, and we've seen, we've looked at hundreds of grantees through our Food Waste Solutions Fund, and we've been really pleased to see that a lot of folks take that into consideration, whether they're in New York, working with a really unique, diverse population, or working in an area that might have a more homogenous population. Either way, we're seeing people respond with that cultural sensitivity and taking into mind, what foods are people going to want, what's going to help bring them dignity, and what's going to make them excited to create a meal out of this food.
So I think,
Can you repeat? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you could repeat the second part of the question.
So the second part of the question, are cans dented on the side safe? And cans dented at the seam pose a problem?
So cans dented on the side are safe. I don't know. I honestly don't know about at the seam. Katie, I don't know if you know any better there. I would think so, as long as there's not like a puncture in the can at the seam, it's fine. But if there's some sort of puncture, then that would be a definite safety concern.
Okay, I think we're at 2:30, so I want to respect folks' time. We do have more questions, and I really appreciate all of these great questions that folks are raising here. We might be able to try to look through some of these questions after the webinar and try to answer some of them in writing, and share that back out with the folks, along with links to where this recording of this webinar will be posted. So I, again, want to thank our excellent presenters and their great presentations, and thank all of you for joining us today. And I wish you well, and take care, everyone. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.